"Mr. Carter, is it true that you have autism?" The courtroom fell silent. The opposing counsel, Richard Hall, leaned forward with a smirk, his voice dripping with false innocence. Daniel Carter's fingers twitched under the table. He inhaled slowly, counting in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. His mother had taught him that numbers were his anchor. They kept him grounded when the world turned chaotic. He looked at the jury. A mix of expressions: curiosity, doubt, sympathy. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let this become a spectacle. Daniel straightened his tie. "Yes, I am autistic." His voice was steady, his tone precise. "And I am also the best attorney in this courtroom today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hall's smirk widened. "Then you wouldn't mind explaining to the jury how your condition affects your ability to read social cues? Wouldn't that mean you might misinterpret testimony? Struggle with emotional nuance?" Daniel's heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He had expected this. Hall was playing dirty, trying to discredit him. But Daniel had spent his entire life preparing for moments like this. He turned to the jury, his dark brown eyes steady. "Autism doesn't affect my ability to see facts, Mr. Hall. It doesn't cloud my sense of justice. If anything, it sharpens it. Because I don't get distracted by bias, theatrics, or cheap tricks." The judge banged his gavel. "Mr. Hall, this line of questioning is dangerously close to discrimination itself. Move on." Hall hesitated but nodded. Daniel allowed himself a small victory. But he knew this was only the beginning. The real battle had just begun. Daniel Carter was representing Michael Brooks, a black scientist who had been denied a promotion despite his impeccable record. The company claimed the decision was based on company culture fit, but the real reason was clear: race. The case had gained national attention. If Daniel won, it would set a precedent for workplace discrimination lawsuits across the country. If he lost, it would send a dangerous message that corporate America could continue hiding racism behind coded language. Daniel had taken the case knowing it wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't anticipated how personal it would become. His autism had always been his strength. It gave him an unmatched memory, a sharp analytical mind, and the ability to see patterns others missed. But now the defense was using it as a weapon against him. And worse, the media was eating it up. The morning after the first court session, Daniel's phone buzzed non-stop. He ignored it, focusing on reviewing his notes, but when his assistant, Maya, burst into his office, he knew something was wrong. "You need to see this," she said, shoving her phone toward him. He took it, scanning the screen. His stomach twisted. A news anchor was speaking, and behind her was a bold headline: "Autistic lawyer handling high-profile case. Is he fit for the job?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "They're predictable." Maya's expression was tight with anger. "They're disgusting. They're trying to turn your autism into a liability. They found some so-called expert who's claiming that your brain works differently, which means you lack the instinct to navigate a case like this." Daniel clenched his jaw. He had expected pushback. He had expected challenges. But this was an attack on his very existence. Still, he wouldn't let them shake him. "They're underestimating me," he said, his voice cool. "That's their mistake." Daniel Carter sat across from Michael Brooks in his dimly lit office, the overhead lamp casting a sharp contrast between light and shadow. His desk was covered in neatly stacked legal briefs, deposition transcripts, and a whiteboard filled with notes and timelines. Michael, a tall man in his early 40s, leaned forward, his expression tight with frustration. "They're trying to rattle us," he said, his deep voice filled with both anger and exhaustion. "They're trying to make this about you instead of the case." Daniel nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the wooden desk in a rhythmic pattern. He wasn't agitated, this was how he processed thoughts. "I know. They think if they can make me the story, they can distract the jury from the real issue." Michael exhaled sharply. "Are you sure we shouldn't address it head-on? Maybe we should put out a public statement, fight back against their narrative?" Daniel shook his head. "That's exactly what they want. They want us to go on the defensive. If we spend time proving my competence, we're playing their game. We don't need to prove I belong here, I already do." Michael rubbed his temples. "So what do we do?" Daniel picked up a marker and turned to the whiteboard. He wrote in bold letters, "Control the narrative." He underlined it twice. "They expect us to argue on their terms," Daniel explained, his voice calm but firm. "They want this trial to be about my autism, my supposed limitations. But we won't let them dictate the conversation." Michael crossed his arms. "And how do we do that?" Daniel turned, meeting his client's eyes. "We shift the focus back where it belongs, the facts. Hard evidence. Undeniable proof. Michael nodded slowly. All right. What's the plan? Daniel pulled out a thick binder and flipped it open to a section marked Precedents. He tapped on one of the highlighted cases. Hall and his team are playing a dangerous game. If they keep pushing the idea that my autism makes me unfit to represent you, they risk crossing into discrimination themselves. Michael's brow furrowed. You mean we could use that against them? Daniel nodded. Exactly. The judge already warned Hall once. If he keeps insinuating that my autism makes me incapable, we can argue that he's engaging in prejudicial tactics, trying to win the case by attacking the attorney instead of addressing the evidence. If we push that angle, it could backfire on them. Michael's lips curled into a small smile. So, if they keep going after you, they're actually strengthening our case? Precisely. Daniel turned to another section of the whiteboard and wrote, Make them feel it. The jury won't just decide based on facts alone. They need to connect with the truth emotionally. Right now, Hall is making this clinical, framing the case as a simple company decision about culture fit. But if we show the real impact of that decision, what it's done to you, what it's done to others like you, we make it impossible for them to ignore the injustice. Michael leaned back, considering. You mean personal testimony? Daniel nodded. Not just yours. Other employees. People who have faced the same barriers. If we can find even one other person from your company who was denied a promotion under similar circumstances, we show a pattern. And once we establish a pattern, Michael's eyes lit up. We prove this isn't an isolated case, it's systemic discrimination. Exactly. Daniel sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. There's one more thing. Michael raised an eyebrow. What? We're going to use my autism as a strength? Michael blinked. Come again? Daniel's voice was steady. Right now, Hall is treating my autism like a weakness. But what he doesn't understand is that my brain sees things differently, and that's why I win cases. I notice patterns others miss. I remember every single detail from every deposition, every file, every statement. Michael smirked. Like having a legal superpower? Daniel gave a small smile. Something like that. He pulled out a document. During discovery, we requested thousands of internal emails from your company. Most lawyers would skim through them, look for obvious red flags. But I went through every single one. Michael sat up straighter. And? Daniel flipped to a specific email. I found this. Michael leaned forward, reading the words out loud. We can't promote Brooks. Leadership won't be comfortable with a black man in that role. Figure out a way to justify it. Michael inhaled sharply. Jesus. Who wrote this? A senior executive. He didn't send it directly, he forwarded it to someone else with just the words understood, so it didn't immediately stand out. But I cross-referenced the original sender's name with other internal conversations. This person was involved in multiple hiring decisions where minorities were passed over. Michael let out a slow whistle. You found the smoking gun? Daniel nodded. We were looking for proof of discrimination in your rejection letter, in official performance reviews. But the real evidence was buried deep in internal emails that they never thought anyone would read so thoroughly. Michael shook his head in disbelief. They underestimated you? Daniel's lips twitched. They always do. Daniel stood up, cracking his knuckles. Tomorrow in court we stay focused. Hall will keep trying to bait me, but I won't engage. Instead, we'll methodically present the evidence, one piece at a time, leading up to this email. Michael nodded. And when we drop the bombshell? Daniel's voice was calm, certain. We let the truth do the work. The strategy was set. Now it was time to execute. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with journalists, activists, corporate executives, and members of the public who had been following the case closely. The tension was thick, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Daniel Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his face unreadable, his hands folded neatly on the desk. His suit was sharp, his tie perfectly aligned, but his focus was entirely on the task ahead. On the other side of the room, Richard Hall adjusted his cufflinks, casting a smug glance at Daniel. Hall thought he had the upper hand. He thought he could undermine Daniel, shake him, turn the jury against him. He had no idea what was coming. Hall rose first, pacing in front of the jury like a seasoned performer. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are here to determine whether my client's company engaged in discrimination. But we must also ask ourselves, can we trust the arguments being made by the opposing counsel? Daniel didn't flinch. He knew where this was going. Hall turned, leveling his gaze at him. Mr. Carter, as you've stated before, you are autistic, correct? Daniel's face remained calm. Yes. Hall clasped his hands behind his back. And would you say that your autism affects your ability to interpret social cues, to understand emotions, to navigate complex interactions? Daniel's fingers twitched once under the table, but he remained composed. Autism affects the way I process information, yes. But I would argue that my ability to analyze facts and evidence is what matters in a court of law. Hall smirked. But the law isn't just about facts, is it? It's about persuasion, credibility, the ability to understand nuance. Wouldn't you agree that a lawyer who struggles with social intuition might miss important cues in witness testimony? The question hung in the air. A calculated blow, designed to plant doubt in the jury's minds. But Daniel was ready. He stood up slowly, adjusting his suit. Mr. Hall, are you suggesting that my autism makes me incapable of representing my client? Hall hesitated for just a second. I'm merely pointing out that I think differently? Daniel pressed. His voice was steady, but his eyes locked onto Hall's like steel. That I analyze information differently? That I don't rely on theatrics or manipulation, but instead focus on logic and evidence. Hall shifted uncomfortably. Daniel turned to the jury, his voice calm but sharp. If anything, my autism is an advantage. I don't get distracted by emotions or bias. I see patterns others miss. And most importantly, I don't fall for cheap tricks. A murmur rippled through the jury box. Hall clenched his jaw, realizing his plan had backfired. Daniel sat back down. If the defense has real arguments, I suggest they make them. Otherwise, we should get back to the actual case. The judge nodded. Agreed. Mr. Hall, move on. Hall exhaled sharply, shifting his papers. He had lost the first round. Now it was Daniel's turn. He stood, walking to the witness stand where Michael Brooks sat, composed but tense. Mr. Brooks, Daniel began, his voice clear, can you describe your qualifications for the jury? Michael nodded. I have a PhD in biochemistry. I've been working at this company for 12 years. My work has led to multiple innovations in our field, and I have trained several junior employees who have since been promoted ahead of me. Daniel nodded. And what reason was given for denying you a promotion? Michael's jaw tightened. They said I didn't fit the company culture. Daniel turned to the jury. Company culture. A vague term. Convenient, isn't it? He picked up a file. Let's look at the company's track record. Over the past decade, 27 promotions were given at the senior level. Of those, how many went to black employees? Michael took a breath. None. The jury murmured. Daniel walked slowly toward the defense table, locking eyes with Hall. And yet, this company claims race was never a factor. Hall shifted but didn't speak. Daniel turned back to Michael. Did you ever receive a negative performance review? No. Were you ever told you lacked leadership skills? No. Were you ever given specific feedback on how to improve? No. Daniel let the silence stretch before he spoke again. And yet, despite being one of the most qualified employees, you were passed over. Repeatedly. Michael's voice was firm. Yes. Daniel turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the numbers don't lie. The facts don't lie. The only question is whether we're willing to see them for what they are. Hall stood, clearly trying to regain control. Objection. These are just numbers. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he walked to his desk and picked up a printed document. You're right, Mr. Hall. Numbers alone don't prove intent. But this does. He held up the email. The courtroom went dead silent. Daniel turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to submit into evidence an internal email from the company's leadership. The judge nodded. Proceed. Daniel handed the document to the court clerk, then read it aloud. We can't promote Brooks. Leadership won't be comfortable with a black man in that role. Figure out a way to justify it. The courtroom exploded in whispers. The jury's faces changed, shock, disbelief, anger. Michael closed his eyes, gripping the edges of the witness stand. Hall's face drained of color. This is taken out of context. Daniel turned sharply. Is it? Because I have multiple other emails that show a pattern of similar discussions. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate decision to deny a qualified black employee an opportunity he had earned. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Hall scrambled. Your Honor, The judge cut him off. I think we've heard enough, Mr. Hall. Daniel turned back to the jury, his voice quieter now but just as powerful. This is what discrimination looks like. Not always in loud, obvious acts, but in quiet decisions made behind closed doors. In vague excuses like company culture. In policies designed to keep people like Mr. Brooks from rising. He let the words settle. This case isn't about me. It's not about my autism. It's about justice. The jury was with him now. He could see it in their faces. And he knew he had won. The defense had played their game. But Daniel had played it better. Now all that was left was the verdict. The courtroom was still reeling from the explosive evidence Daniel had just presented. The email had changed everything. The jury, who had once seemed uncertain, now wore expressions of shock and anger. The judge had ordered a brief recess to let things settle, but Daniel knew the battle wasn't over yet. Richard Hall was too experienced to go down without a fight. And Daniel was right. When court resumed, Hall rose with a slow, deliberate confidence. He straightened his tie and approached the bench. Your Honor, I move to have the email evidence dismissed on the grounds that it was obtained improperly. A murmur ran through the room. Daniel's jaw clenched. He had expected Hall to try something, but this was a direct attack on his credibility. The judge adjusted his glasses. Explain, Mr. Hall. Hall turned, facing the jury with the kind of ease that came from years of courtroom battles. Mr. Carter has demonstrated an impressive ability to analyze evidence. But let's talk about how he acquired this particular email. He turned to Daniel. Mr. Carter, can you tell the court exactly when and how you found this email? Daniel kept his face impassive. It was included in the documents submitted during discovery. Hall nodded. And how many emails were submitted? Daniel knew where this was going, but he answered anyway. Over 10,000. Hall chuckled. 10,000 emails. That's a lot to sift through. And yet, you, alone, found the single most incriminating piece of evidence. The email that no one else saw. That no other lawyer flagged. How exactly did you manage that? Daniel remained calm. I have an exceptional memory and a strong ability to recognize patterns. I noticed inconsistencies in certain conversations and cross-referenced them. Hall smiled as if he had been waiting for this answer. That's fascinating. But let's be honest, Mr. Carter. Most attorneys would have used software to filter through thousands of emails. It would take days to manually review them all. Are you saying you memorized them? Daniel met his gaze. I reviewed them in detail, yes. Hall pounced. Or did you, perhaps, use automated scripts to access and filter emails in a way that was not disclosed to the court? A sharp gasp rippled through the spectators. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. He knew what Hall was implying. He was suggesting that Daniel had used his technical skills, and his autistic hyperfocus, to manipulate or access information outside of the agreed discovery process. The judge frowned. Mr. Hall, are you accusing Mr. Carter of misconduct? Hall spread his hands innocently. I'm simply asking how he managed to find something that no other attorney, on either side, caught. If Mr. Carter has special abilities that allow him to process data in ways others can't, shouldn't we be concerned about whether this evidence was obtained properly? Daniel inhaled slowly, keeping his anger in check. Hall wasn't just attacking his methods. He was weaponizing Daniel's autism against him in a new way. He was implying that Daniel's brain worked too well, that he was too skilled, and therefore he must have done something dishonest. It was a trap. And Daniel had seconds to escape it. Daniel stood up, smoothing his suit. Your Honor, the defense is attempting to discredit me by suggesting that because I think differently, I must have done something unethical. Hall started to object, but Daniel raised a hand. Let's break this down. Mr. Hall is implying that my ability to sift through data more efficiently than his team means I must have cheated. That's like saying a chess grandmaster must be cheating because they see moves others don't. Or that a doctor diagnosing a rare disease is suspicious because they connected the symptoms faster than their colleagues. A few jurors nodded, the logic clicking into place. Daniel turned directly to Hall. If your team overlooked the email, that's your oversight, Mr. Hall. But don't mistake competence for misconduct. Hall opened his mouth, then closed it. The judge tapped his gavel. Mr. Hall, unless you have actual evidence of wrongdoing, I will not allow baseless accusations. The email remains in evidence. Daniel sat down. Hall's jaw was tight, his face red. His plan had backfired. But Daniel wasn't done yet. After Hall's failed attempt to have the evidence dismissed, Daniel sensed something deeper at play. There was desperation in Hall's actions, something that told Daniel this email wasn't just damning, it was dangerous. During another recess, Daniel pulled Maya, his assistant, aside. There's something we're missing. Hall wasn't just trying to discredit me, he was trying to bury this email. I need you to dig deeper. Maya's eyes narrowed. You think there's more? Daniel nodded. I think we've only scratched the surface. Hours later, as Daniel was preparing his final arguments, Maya burst into the office, her laptop in hand. You were right. There's more. She placed the laptop in front of him, showing a document she had cross-referenced with company records. Daniel's stomach clenched. The email wasn't just from a senior executive. It was from someone who had direct ties to the judge. Judge Monroe, the very man presiding over the case, had been a silent investor in the company. If this case went in Michael Brooks' favor, it could expose years of unethical business dealings that Monroe had benefited from. This case had never just been about racial discrimination. It was about corruption. And the person controlling the verdict had a vested interest in making sure Daniel lost. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. They had walked into a rigged game. But now Daniel knew how to break it. When court resumed, Daniel stood. Your Honor, I have reason to believe there is a conflict of interest in this case. Judge Monroe raised an eyebrow. Mr. Carter, this is highly irregular. Daniel remained firm. Your Honor, do you deny that you have financial ties to the defendant's company? Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The jury sat up straighter. Judge Monroe's face darkened. Mr. Carter, tread carefully. Daniel held up a stack of papers. These are public financial records showing your investments. You must recuse yourself from this case. Hall shot up from his chair. Objection. This is outrageous. But the damage was done. The judge had gone pale. He looked down at the documents, then back at Daniel. A long silence followed. Then, in a voice tight with restrained fury, Judge Monroe spoke. This court is adjourned until further review. A new judge will be assigned to this case. Daniel exhaled slowly as the gavel struck. He had done it. The case was no longer rigged. Now true justice had a chance. And Richard Hall? He had lost more than just a case. He had lost everything. The courtroom battle had been brutal. But Daniel Carter had done what no one expected. He had turned the attack against him into the very thing that won the case. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for the jury to return. The tension was so thick it felt like the air itself had weight. The entire trial had been a battle, legal, personal, and ethical. But now all that was left was the decision. Daniel Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded neatly, his face calm. On the surface he appeared unaffected, but inside he was calculating every possible outcome. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to the jury. Michael Brooks, sitting beside him, exhaled shakily. Do you think we did enough? Daniel turned to him, his voice steady. The truth is on our side. They saw it. They felt it. Now they just have to act on it. Across the room, Richard Hall sat rigid, his usual arrogance dimmed. After his failed attempts to discredit Daniel and bury the evidence, after Judge Monroe was forced to recuse himself due to a conflict of interest, Hall had been backed into a corner. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. If the jury ruled in Michael's favor, it would set a precedent that could open the floodgates for other discrimination lawsuits against the company. Millions of dollars were at stake. Careers would be ruined. Hall and his clients had everything to lose. And that made them desperate. After what felt like an eternity, the bailiff finally announced, the jury has reached a verdict. A hush fell over the courtroom as 12 men and women filed back into their seats. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, held the verdict form in her hands. The judge, now a newly assigned impartial one, nodded. Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous decision? We have, Your Honor. The courtroom was so silent that the rustling of the paper sounded deafening. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The foreperson cleared her throat. In the matter of Michael Brooks versus Janssen Biotech Corporation, on the charge of racial discrimination in employment and unlawful denial of promotion, we, the jury, find in favor of. A single second stretched into an eternity. The plaintiff, Michael Brooks? The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Michael gripped the edge of the table, his breath catching. Daniel allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. But the foreperson wasn't done. She adjusted her glasses and continued reading. Furthermore, we award the plaintiff $15 million in damages, citing egregious and intentional discriminatory practices. A sharp intake of breath came from the defense table. The number was huge. Hall shot up. Your Honor, The judge banged his gavel. Sit down, Mr. Hall. Hall collapsed back into his chair, his face drained of color. His clients, the executives of Janssen Biotech, looked like they had just been punched in the gut. Michael turned to Daniel, his eyes wide with disbelief. We won. Daniel's lips twitched in the smallest smile. Yes, we did. Michael exhaled, his hands shaking slightly. He looked around the courtroom at the reporters scribbling furiously, at the corporate lawyers whispering in panic. Then he looked at Daniel, his expression shifting from shock to something else, gratitude. "Thank you," he said, voice thick with emotion. Daniel met his gaze. "You earned this, Michael. This was always about the truth." Michael nodded slowly. "Yeah. But without you they would have buried it." As the courtroom emptied, the media swarmed. Cameras flashed. Reporters threw questions. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to win such a high-profile case? Do you think this verdict will change corporate hiring practices? Mr. Carter, how do you respond to those who doubted your abilities due to your autism?" Daniel paused at that last question. He turned, looking directly at the journalist who had asked it. "Throughout this trial, certain people tried to use my autism as a weakness," he said, his voice measured. "They underestimated me because I think differently. Because I process information in a way they don't understand." He let that settle before continuing. "But today we proved that different is not less. My autism didn't hinder me, it helped me see the truth that others missed. And that's what won this case." The cameras flashed faster. Michael stepped forward, adding, "And it's not just about Daniel. This is about every black professional who's been told they don't fit the culture. Every qualified candidate who's been shut out because of race. Today the jury sent a message: discrimination has consequences." The crowd erupted in more questions, but Daniel and Michael didn't stop. They walked past them out of the courthouse into the world that had just changed. Later that night, as Daniel sat in his office, reviewing documents for his next case, Maya walked in, her face unreadable. "You're going to want to see this," she said, placing a printed news article on his desk. Daniel took it, scanning the headline. "Janssen Biotech CEO resigns amid scandal. FBI investigating broader discrimination practices." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "They're launching a federal investigation?" Maya nodded. "The verdict opened a floodgate. Other employees are coming forward. Whistleblowers, old reports, hidden emails. This case was just the beginning." Daniel exhaled. He had won. But more importantly, he had exposed something much bigger. Maya tilted her head. "So, what now?" Daniel tapped his fingers on the desk, already thinking ahead. "Now?" He looked up, his eyes sharp, focused. "We go after the next one." Justice had been served. But for Daniel Carter, the fight was just beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please show your support by liking this video, share and subscribe to our channel. Also turn on the post notification bell so that you will be notified each time we post a story.